And now we are live. Hey guys, Wayne Fillmore here. I'm here with Pastor Mike,
Howdy. Good to be with you.
General Han Solo. Good to be with you as well. Um, so basically, there was a request by Pastor Mike to basically have this hangout and discuss my last debate with King Crocoduck, among other things. Um, but as well, I guess Pastor Mike, you can take the floor.
Sure. Hey, so I noticed that you'd had this debate. I haven't watched many of these the great debate community debates. I haven't seen too much of it, a little bit here and there, And I saw that you were debating this guy King Crocoduck. I know I've seen his name, pop up here and there in different like YouTube videos, but I couldn't say I know a lot about the guy.
Mhm.
So I watched your guys' debate and I listened to it, and I felt very compelled like to respond to it. I thought, okay, first off, it is really rare to have an atheist, and I want to congratulate King Crocoduck on this. It's really rare to have an atheist who will actually put out a syllogism, a a a simple logical argument of point one, point two, conclusion. This is why atheism is true. It's a positive case for atheism. That's very rare, and so I applaud him for that. It gives us something good to talk about. But I think that the reason why it's rare is because atheism is not true. So it's difficult to build really good syllogisms for something that's not true. And so it ends up exposing the error of it. This is why a lot of atheists have fallen back on a really soft definition of atheism, like it's a lack of belief in God or gods. And that way I have no position to defend. You have to prove you're right. Otherwise you're wrong. And I can just attack all day long and criticize rather than sort of represent a position. So I applaud him for that. But I really wanted to talk about what he had said. I thought it would be fruitful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, even before we even get into that, because that's more like the meat and potatoes of the hangout. But something first I wanted to get out the way as well is I I do want to say I one of the biggest things I wanted to model in the debate was that Christians can have gracious dialogues with non-believers. We can uh, sit down and we can have a conversation about screaming and hollering or trying to threaten people with hellfire. So I hope people look at that video and they see that's how a Christian is supposed to represent themselves. Whether people think the arguments are good or not. Maybe I could have used better arguments. Maybe I couldn't have. But as a matter of fact, King Crocoduck emailed me. I think he emailed me on Saturday, but I didn't read it until today. And I just got a chance to get back to him. And we will be having more discussions in the future, so that won't be our last one. But somebody actually they gave me some words of wisdom, and they basically had a quote from some great mega apologist who I never heard of, and the quote basically summed up. It said, "When you go through a debate or discussion and you think you might have lost, take that as something to learn from because you can think about the things you could have said while you were debating or whatever." And so, one thing that I wish I would have thought of even before I had the debate because I already had in my mind what I was going to do and etc. But if I were to go back and do it again, um, I I wish I could have really touched on the standard of evidence a lot more because I noticed after having that debate, I noticed that Ken Crockett would say, well, the standard of evidence for Christianity or the amount of evidence for Christianity is very tenuous and is very low, and we don't have a lot of evidence for God and et cetera, et cetera. And in my mind, I think that the standard, I think the evidence we do have for Christianity meets the standard of evidence pretty well. And I think when it comes to atheists, they put the standard of evidence up so high that it makes it makes their atheism unfalsifiable. So all they have to do is deny, 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 and a position like that is just too easy.
Yeah, there was a
Yeah,
point
just
I'm sorry, go ahead, Robert.
could I just jump in just very quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
very true. I mean, I debated Aaron Ra, and he was conceding all the points I was making, saying, "Okay, I'll give you that. Like, I'll give you the Exodus and so on." But then, out of the same breath, he'll say, "But that doesn't prove God or your God or the God in the scriptures." So that's where in the GDC I made the comment. Well, how much evidence is required ultimately to prove the God of the scriptures, because now I've showcased practically every part of the passage in the narrative to be authentically in a historical context. Obviously, the word God appears in that narrative. So therefore, you just, according to you, you have to cut out every instance of the word God and just leave the narrative as if it's just a pure natural, event. And
Right.
that you're completely right, Wayne. That I've noticed that mentality is they scream and cry for evidence. You give the evidence, and then it goes down as somewhat philosophical, strained type like argument of, oh well, that doesn't ultimately prove the God of that that scripture,
Right.
and hence it's unfalsifiable in that context.
I actually had a really similar moment with Doug from the YouTube channel Pine Creek, when we talked, where it was at one point he theorized that just because a biblical prophecy may be true, it doesn't mean that the biblical God is true. And it was kind of like, can you pause for a moment and consider what version of reality you're suggesting here, where biblical prophecies are true, but they're like seemingly just deliberately deceiving you about which God is giving them. Like it's this sort of tricky God, and that doesn't seem very likely to me. It just seems like at some point you're just reaching, and I just think of those movies where you have like somebody who does all these backflips through like some sort of laser grid and they come out totally safe and fine. And that's sort of what I think some people imagine they're doing in these debates, is like, I'm flipping through all this stuff and I came out squeaky clean. The problem is when you're just wrong on facts, you don't actually leave scars and slashes on you, unlike lasers,
Right.
But yeah.
And also,
I like that analogy. I like that analogy. I'm going to use that.
I wrote a post about this earlier, and the post is a lot more better spoken than what I just said. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the post, and then we can move on. But I really do think that and I'll read it. Okay, it says, if atheists wish to engage in a discussion with their counterparts, if they have evidential modesty, then both parties ought to agree that the evidentiary standard is, one, not perfect. The evidentiary standard is not perfect, because there is no such thing as perfect evidence. Perfect evidence does not exist. Humans always could interpret a piece of evidence incorrectly because humans can have flawed reasoning. Standard is not a perfect standard. We are flawed human beings. If I had to just let one point be known, like throughout every conversation I have with an atheist, like from now on, I think that is like the main point. I want to, as a matter of fact, you guys know that something similar happened with Bart Ehrman, where Bart Ehrman, he went to college so he could look into biblical studies and etc. And his standard of evidence for the Gospels was the Gospels are inerrant, perfect word of God, and everything in the scriptures is perfect, and etc. etc. And he went to school and he found out, well, there could be copies, errors, and there could be this and there could be that, because the Gospels were written by men. And he loses his faith. Evidence was unrealistic.
Well, I do think the Gospels are inerrant, but I see your point about saying, if you had to abandon that position, does that mean you must therefore throw out every Christian belief you have because you had a view of inerrancy that you found was not correct? Does that mean that the Bible's not inspired because it's not inerrant? And I think that you're right in that. You don't have to there's, the atheist wants to imply that if you could find anything wrong with Christianity, then everything's wrong with Christianity. At least some atheists want to imply that. Certainly not all of them.
Oh, and one of the last things I'm going to say, I got at least two more points, but one of the last things I want to say is, I had wrote this, and I had said, the standard of evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt, not any possible doubt that could ever exist. That because when we have these discussions with atheists, they'll say, Well, what about this? This could have happened. What about etc. And like, sure, like we could grant those things, but like, why would we when it's not reasonable at all? Those are just some things I just wanted to get out the way. And in my future discussions with atheists, I think if we come to a common ground about what do you mean by evidence, and what type of evidence would you accept, and what standard of evidence are you going by, and what will falsify your position, and once we lay like the groundwork for what the standard of evidence is, then we can start to give our evidences, or the atheists can give their evidences towards us, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Sound crazy?
Yeah. In debate too, it's also good to remember that you don't have to convince your opponent of anything. Their job is to try to marshal the best case they can for their position. Your job is to marshal the best case you can for your position, and the debate is really for the viewers and for the people that are watching. And so if you realize, like, I don't have to convince you of anything to show that my position is reasonable, then it makes it easier for you. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't had. I mean, I haven't really ever done like what you just did, a timed, back and forth debate like that. I've never done it. Maybe one of these days I would. Sure seems exciting to do. But,
Yeah, it was exciting. I think one of my first like official time debates was General and I. General and I had a debate with Ken Hovind last year. It's up on my Facebook page. I'll tag you in it.
Yeah, go ahead. that'd be an interesting one to watch. Yeah. I've seen his old debates, Ken Hovind's old debates and stuff like that. But and a lot of stuff.
I think there's nothing new under the sun.
Well, I think Ken Hovind. I think he used to be a good debater. Although I don't agree with his, his younger position, but I still think he was a pretty good debater.
He is a skilled debater, that's for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So so here's the thing. Maybe we could get to that syllogism. Is it cool?
Oh yeah, sure.
That's what I'm chomping at the bit to talk about.
Let's go for it.
Okay. Right. Okay. I've never done this. Is like my third hangout or something of all time. So there's like a share screen function. Can I do that? Can I do that to just show the syllogism? How do I do that?
Okay.
Screen share. Oh, I see a button.
Your mouse.
Oh. Ooh, look. Yep. Ooh, it seems very intuitive. There it is.
Yep. There you go.
All right.
I'll present you, and
awesome. I'm going to make this bigger for you guys, just for anybody who might be watching on a cell phone. Oh, that's not going to work. That's about as big as it goes. All right. So this is the syllogism. This is his actual syllogism. And he introduced it, King Crocoduck, by saying, hey, I'm going to present here not only rebuttals to your arguments, but I'm going to present a positive case for atheism. And this was it. And like I said, I was really happy that he did this. I thought it spoke highly of his, I don't know, it spoke highly of something. I liked it. So number one, everything that exists is natural. Is natural. Number two, God is not natural. Number three, conclusion, God does not exist. This is a big deal because this is the singular argument for atheism that he presented. Notice that he actually didn't present an argument to say God has not spoken. That was actually the debate topic, right? But he didn't present that. It wasn't about God has revealed himself or hasn't revealed himself. This would be more like God, whether God could or couldn't reveal himself is irrelevant because he doesn't exist. So it was a little actually off the topic of the debate, but I thought it was interesting. So number one, everything that exists is natural. Let's take this concept for a second. That's naturalism, right? My concern to start off with is this. There's a problem here. Naturalism includes in its very nature, in its no pun intended, that God does not exist. The conclusion is inside of naturalism. In fact, if you're going to argue for naturalism as evidence against the existence of God, you are creating a much larger, more difficult thing to argue for than simply saying God doesn't exist, because now you have to argue against all immaterial realities, all non-natural things. You have to argue against a whole host of things beyond just God, and including God's not existing, because if any of these exist, premise one is wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, would I also go further and say that, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but the very word natural there, can that be nuanced into, so we have to define what is natural, like
That was
what
another,
is real, what is physical.
yeah. I'm glad you noticed that. That was one of my points. So what is natural? What is natural anyways? Does it mean things that are physical? I don't know what he meant by natural. Does he mean things that happen? Because some people use the word like that, right?
Yeah, if you want to say also like logical, well, God technically is logical. I mean, there's nothing wrong with.
In one sense, God is, in one sense, God is natural. He's the most natural thing because he's the eternal, permanently existent, self-sufficient. The most natural thing in all of reality is God, and all else was made subsequent to him. So in a sense, he's natural. So I'm not sure what is meant by the word natural either, but
well, if you, I did give a response, and it, like I said, it seemed like every time I spoke, like it just fell on deaf ears. Like I could have not spoken at all, and I still would have gotten the same response out of the people in the Great Debate community. So that's not really like a big deal. I'm sure if we had like a broader audience, more ears would have been reached. But I think I had said, because I had cleared it up, and I said, so are you looking for evidence of the supernatural? Do you want to see something supernatural? And he said yes. And I said, I don't even know what that would look like. Like, could you explain that to me? And we didn't really go anywhere because it wasn't like that. I don't think that's a falsifiable novel prediction. I think that's an unfalsifiable prediction. They call it a immutable hypothesis.
Hey, am I doing something that's making my big head stay on the screen this whole time?
No. Yeah, I think.
Oh, hold on. Yeah, I
think you stopped sharing my.
Yeah, there you go. Stop presenting.
Okay, sorry about
there you go.
Oh, I just thought everyone's gonna see the boogers in my nose for a second now. So let's. I mean, what do you guys think? Okay, here's my response, and I want you to give me. What do you think would be? Someone's using their electric shaver in there. What do you think would be, say, King Crocoduck or the equivalent? Their best rebuttal to what I just said is the problem. To try to say God doesn't exist, you've cast a much larger umbrella, which includes God, just asserted that none of those things exist, and then concluded that therefore God doesn't exist. It seems circular to me, and it seems like you've made the problem worse instead of better.
Yeah, I'll give my perspective, speaking as practically on the same scientific terms as King Crocoduck. So he's a physicist, and I'm also in the same realm. When I interact with, well, what some some were atheists, but now they become Christian, but a few others have now become more agnostic. But when I would interact with those guys, say in a lab setting, the God question doesn't even come up. So you do your science experiments, you do whatever you need to do. Even if you're teaching in class, you're teaching math and physical concepts and so on. Again, the whole God thing doesn't come up. But that's what I find quite ironically fascinating about that, and that is, it's like as if the scientist has horse blinders on as far as observing reality. So if I mean, as something as simple as a mug. Now, there are physicists that go as far as to say, yeah, the mug at first sight, like just at the surface level, looks really basic, it looks really boring. But then when you start to realize the intricate, say, calculus that's involved with it, and then if you wanted to go down to the quantum state of every the lattice structure of the atoms that make up the mug and so on. I mean, you can go down from the macro scale to the micro scale, and then really notice the beautiful complexities involved that makes this mug's existence to be a natural existence. But notice it's still sort of with the horse blinders on, where you're just looking at it through a physical lens. They don't think about the epistemic, the what's happening beyond the scenes, so to speak. They don't ask that question. They don't go, you know what? Why does this even exist the way it does? Why does time move in one direction that causes these constants and laws of physics to remain the way they are, so that the mug can be the way it is? Those questions are rarely asked or even thought about. And so therefore, King Crocodile, his response to you, Mike, would be basically that. I don't care. I don't have time to ask that question. I just go do my thing, and it works. Like the science works, the math works, and that satisfies me. And therefore, if God exists, I expect him to approach me at that surface level way of thinking that I have in the lab. I don't know if it makes sense to you, but I hope you can see what I'm saying.
Yeah. So it sounds kind of like maybe he might say, like, Mike, that's how science works. But that sounds like an assumption being turned into a conclusion, or maybe a method being turned into a philosophy. Like I have a method for science. Like, I'm studying physical things and how physical things interact with other physical things naturally. And
right.
Everything I study, I always come up with natural conclusions and but I'm only allowed to, because that's the philosophy, that's methodological naturalism. And then I just assume that since my realm of study only finds those things, that's all that exists. But
right.
But let me give.
That's ironic, isn't it? They don't realize that they're doing philosophy at the end of the day, but through a scientific lens.
I had someone tell me one time in comments, they were saying there is no such thing as philosophy in science. They must have read that philosophy was dead. And then I said, I was like, there's literally, you can get your master's in philosophy of science. I mean, this is a very important field. Like, science doesn't exist without a philosophy by which it operates. Anyhow, let me give you guys some examples of things that I think, and this is something that, Wayne, you did this. You brought up math as an example of like an immaterial reality. I think that's one of the points you were making through that. But think about this. Math is an immaterial reality. We'll get to King Crocodile's response to that, right? And then but also moral truth. Morals are not immaterial. They're simply, they're not material. They're immaterial realities, moral truths. Laws of logic, these things are not material, but they're real in some sense. Persons, the very idea of a person themselves, this is an immaterial thing. Purpose, value, ghosts, miracle stories, testimonies of relationship with God, the evidence for things like miraculous stuff like the resurrection of Christ. All of those things must be false for premise one to be true in this syllogism. Premise one is a much more bold claim.
That's if you interpret the word natural there to be purely physical and nothing more, like physical in the sense of a laboratory and what we perceive at the surface level. Yeah.
And if you do interpret the word natural to mean something very broad, then it no longer applies to God. And so for it to work, it's got to be, the type of natural that I've been talking about. But if you're going to say natural just means like, and you come up with some really complex, weird definition for it, it may not even apply to God at all at that point, in which case premise two will not be true.
Right.
So here's what's weird to me. Let's say I'm an atheist and I see this syllogism. How do I not see this flaw? Like, I'll prove God doesn't exist by proving God and a whole bunch of other things don't exist. That seems to be making things worse instead of better.
Wait, can you repeat that again, Mike?
This syllogism seems to be saying, in order to prove God doesn't exist, I will prove that God, numbers, like as abstract objects, moral truth, laws of logic, person's free will, purpose, actual value, ghosts, miracles, testimonies of relationship with God, I'll prove all of that doesn't exist in order to prove that God doesn't exist.
Then, like, as an atheist, you're defeating your own argument. But I guess an atheist wouldn't think of it in that way, because I notice most atheists have a very strong relationship with science. And like General said, I don't think they understand that science is a slave to philosophy, and so they'll try and kill off philosophy, not understanding that. As a matter of fact, the perfect analogy is um somebody throwing something like a weight off of a hill, and it's attached to their leg, and throwing the weight off the hill, they go down with it and kill themselves.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a general attitude towards non-material things, or the topic of metaphysics, not in the spooky, ooky stuff, but in the more legitimate, science that it is. So here's my case, because I want to be critiqued as harshly as possible in my own views.
Right.
I really do, because that's how you get at truth, right? So I think that if you have to say premise one is not true, if I understand how he's using natural, you have to say premise one's not true. And some of the ways you can say this are the laws of logic do not fall within the description of natural. There's one example of something that rebuts premise number one. The laws of logic themselves,
as in like ontologically, the laws of logic are beyond physical. Because again, when you say natural, I would say the laws of logic are natural. But again, this is where the nuance comes in of how he's using the word natural there. Right?
Yeah. So if you say the laws of logic are natural, but by natural I mean naturally existing, of course they exist. That's natural. Well, then God exists in that definition as well. So now now premise two no longer applies to God. I can no longer say God is not natural. And so then the argument falls apart for a new reason, because I've redefined natural so that I can allow the laws of logic to be natural. Well, now God is natural too. So my argument fails. But I think the laws of logic and rationality they're not even scientifically discoverable. They're simply, you must have them. They exist by necessity. If they didn't exist, you literally couldn't prove they didn't exist. In fact, they couldn't not exist, because their non-existence would be a fact that would conform to the laws of logic.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
it boggles the mind, right? The laws of logic are a necessity of existence. They exist of necessity, as God does. So I think there's some parallels there.
Well, then I could tell you what he probably would say. He probably say something like, but we can make logical descriptions about the laws of logic, like the law of excluded middle. People made that, and so there you go.
That's what he did with math, right? He said the same kind of thing with math.
Yep.
So he goes, we made those up. We made those laws of logic. And then he says, and I actually wrote it out. Okay, here's the quote from King Crocoduck about math. He says about the axioms of math, that the selection of these axioms, quote, the selection of these axioms is entirely arbitrary. And then to prove that point, he says, there are situations where it works and situations where it doesn't. Now follow me here. This seems like insanity.
Okay, what's your? I'd like to hear your critique on that. Here's
my critique.
How did you? Yeah, go ahead.
If there are some situations where the axioms work and some where they don't, that's the very definition of not being arbitrary. This is the opposite of arbitrary. I selected my 9-iron arbitrarily because there's some situations where it works and some where it doesn't. Well, that's not arbitrary. You select it for the purpose because it works. In reality, it actually works sometimes. So the axioms of math, even if they're not 100% used in every scenario, they're literal functioning axioms that you select for their usefulness, for their function, because they actually do work. So if math was really truly arbitrary, then you couldn't build a boat. You couldn't go to the moon. You couldn't know how deep down you had to go to create a foundation for this size building that you were going to build. You wouldn't know how much you were supposed to pay at the store when you went shopping. Think of this. In order to
I'm actually right.
Yeah,
I'm very surprised that King Crocoduck made that statement, because again, I teach, say, multivariate calculus, So I'm already at that level of pretty high in mathematics, and yeah, in maths for example, John Lennox, the famous Christian mathematician, his dissertation is on what you call subnormal groups. Now this stuff is just, I would consider it alien talk, an alien language. But yeah, it's just like crazy axioms within that work, sub-C of normal groups. And so, but interestingly, I think what King Crocoduck was getting at is that mathematics. Now this is Mike. So you're on point on this, and I think King Crocoduck didn't realize he's making a fool of himself here. To be honest, math. So if you were to write an equation, I'll just be very simple. If you were to write an equation on, say, I don't know, describing, say, the acceleration of say, Earth's gravity or something. Now, we obviously can derive equations and hence place constants within the equation, dependent on where you're positioned. So if you're positioned on the surface, then it's 9.8. But if you go further up, then it goes less and less and less in the acceleration. Now, the thing is that you can derive equations accurately. So algebraically, you can develop a formula to explain certain phenomena. But sometimes there are variables missing that, with further research, when you figure out those variables, sometimes the equation can be wrong, even though you've accurately done it algebraically. So wrong in the sense that it doesn't apply to the phenomena. And therefore, the whole notion of it being made arbitrarily is false, because you're using laws of logic, you're using the principles of mathematics, how to derive equations and so on, to make out an accurate equation, but the equation doesn't match the phenomena. So therefore, what you have to do is go back to the drawing board, insert any new variables that you found, and then again derive the equation, and voila, there you go. Now you can describe, say, planetary motion or something. So yeah, this whole notion of it being arbitrary, no, I don't think so. In fact, it's not arbitrary when the equation is wrong, and it's not arbitrary when the equation is right. You're using the laws of logic either way. You're maintaining a rigidness to it. So yeah.
I want to say this because I'm actually about to shut it down for now. I have work tomorrow. Had this been like a Saturday or Friday, I probably would be able to go a lot longer. But I do want to say one of the most concerning things that he said was that Christianity, when it first started, had political, and I think he said, did he say financial? I know he said it had political motives, and it is a cult. And every writing outside of the biblical eyewitness testimonies of Jesus describe Jesus as a cult leader.
That's tantamount to saying that everybody who didn't believe in Jesus didn't believe in Jesus. It doesn't mean anything. It just doesn't. Only his believers thought he rose from the dead for real. Yeah. You want someone who didn't believe in him to say that he really died, really rose again, really fulfilled all the prophecies, really is the Son of God, but I don't believe in him. Like that, is that the standard? Then you'll believe it. Then you'll just go, oh, they really did believe him. He just pretended to not be a believer. Like it's a silly standard. Yeah, in the historicity, he suggested that Muhammad and Muhammad's miracles were more historically accurate and historically supported, that's the term I should use, historically supported, than the miracles of Jesus. Or that Joseph Smith was more historically supported in his miraculous claims than Jesus. And I'm like, that just blows my mind that you can even say that. Just because it happened more recently doesn't mean it's more historically supported. Like, this is,
and not just that, but Muhammad made no miracles. In the Quran and the Hadith, you see the notion of them asking questions like, hang on a second, doesn't a prophet involve some form of miracle, and yet Muhammad does none? Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Like,
I don't know where he got that.
what miracles did he supposedly do? He supposedly showed some guys golden plates. Like, that's not miraculous. Like, that's,
You know, splitting the moon is not, and that never happened either. So
yeah. So it was weird how casually they cast off the historicity of the gospel accounts by comparisons that were unfair and simply not true. And this is where I would want any atheist watching this to go, listen, these are simply untruths being used to combat the truth claims of Christianity. What does that say to you?
there's a certain bias and agenda. That's what it is.
Yeah. Big time. And he's read Bart Ehrman stuff, because he talked about how he implied you couldn't trust the historical claims of the New Testament because of the manuscript transmission, copies of copies of copies of copies. You know, they've read Bart Ehrman when they say copies of copies of copies of copies.
Right.
But Bart Ehrman,
I was trying to hit as many points as I could, because right after he said that, he said something about why did Mark write his gospel so late, and I did touch on that. So
yeah. Well, we have 1 Corinthians 15 is dated to within 10 years, very, very possibly within 5 years of the actual resurrection. The content of 1 Corinthians 15, it's an early church creed about the appearances of Christ, the death and resurrection of Christ, and the accounts are unanimous. Like, anyway, there's a reason why you have to go to fringe historians to support this view. There's a reason why you have Richard Carrier, and you've got oh gosh, you couldn't remember his name either. What's his name? Robert Price.
There you go.
Yeah,
Bob Price. Yeah. Who else do you have?
Yeah,
those two.
They're the only two people. They're on the planet, but like they're the only two out of like the on the shoulders of giants, basically.
Yeah. And what's more important is you can actually show that their standards are unfair. You know, Richard Carrier's, it seems to me, as I've been trying to learn some of his stuff, his case for Jesus not being a historical figure is built off this really elaborate scheme of plotting and careful planning and all these weird parallelisms between Jesus and these other things. And it's extremely complex. It is extremely complex.
Yeah, you're talking about his recent 2014 book, On History of Jesus, that one?
I haven't read his book. I've been watching his videos online. So, but his case is, he talks about his views of Paul versus his views of the Gospels. They had different agendas and different. It's bizarre.
It's all a big conspiracy because the Illuminati really made the Bible. Don't you know?
I've heard that one too. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm at a loss for words, but what I will say is, the arguments that I did present, that I definitely do think they had some merit. They were overlooked, and the only reason they were overlooked is because this community is highly skeptical, and that's okay, because we'll be having more discussions in the future, and maybe it'll be more fruitful, and that's all I can pretty much say about that.
Yeah, and you brought up like the possibility of God bringing himself up. Like, I wrote down some of your points that I thought were like, okay, the universe reveals to us things about God. He's the maker of it. It reveals that, like, has God revealed himself? That seems like a good point to me. God's different than us, and so a great way to communicate would be to enter creation. That would be great in theory. I agree with that point. And then you talked about Jesus and evidence for the resurrection being evidence that God has in fact done that very thing.
Yes.
This seems like a really good point to me, and the response was just blowing off. Notice this: you gave a case for the resurrection, Wayne, and you offered responses to alternate explanations people give. You know, like, did the disciples steal the body, that kind of thing. In response to this, he did not say that a true resurrection is an irrational response to the facts of history. He said that those simply aren't the facts of history. Now, in that, he's on the fringe, not you. I think that's very telling.
Yeah, just because, I mean, just because you can have some form of, and I hate to say this, but some form of like celeb status, and then an assertion like that, it gives off that impression that, well, then that's a done deal, right? But actually, no, he would be on the fringe in that context. Even Bart Ehrman would disagree with him on that. Like, obviously in regards to the resurrection, but as far as the historical Jesus is concerned, Bart Ehrman would laugh that off.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. In fact, I love the debate I watched between Bart Ehrman and William Lane Craig on the resurrection. And Bart Ehrman, his major case in the debate, summarized the whole debate. He says, as a historian, you are a priori not allowed to say that a miracle took place. And so therefore, as a historian, you cannot say that Jesus rose from the dead simply because you assume it, right? After that debate, because he granted all the 5 historical facts that William Lane Craig said, these are accepted. After that debate, Bart Ehrman rethought, I think he saw how silly he was, and he rethought his theory, and he said, no, there was no real empty tomb. He realized he couldn't escape the conclusion of the resurrection, so he just rewrote the history of it. There was no empty tomb. There was no real burial with Joseph of Arimathea. But
And the way he says
his
it,
unbelief. It's
Right.
not pushed by the evidence.
Right. Well, remember, King Karakadek did the same thing, because I said, well, I asked him, I said, how would you explain the empty tomb? And he said, we don't even know if there was an empty tomb to begin with.
Yeah,
Mm.
because it's powerful evidence. That's why. So I thought you did great bringing that up, Wayne, and I think it was a good point that was not well responded to.
Yeah, a lot of things fell on deaf ear and background and bad soil and stuff like that. So hopefully, like I said, next time, who knows what'll happen. But and also, General, you made a good point when somebody who doesn't have that celeb status is going up against somebody who is like very popular or well received by a lot of people, well liked. It really didn't matter what he would have said, I believe, because 95% of the audience was already on his side anyway. So.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, Wayne, the main thing is, like I was telling G-Man, this concept of phlotium. So it's in 1 Thessalonians 4, and it's you know how Paul says to work with your own hands, to mind your business, to have a sense of like an honorable position in what you do in your life. In this case, you're a Christian. Be the best theologian, be the best scientist, be the best be the best in the skill set that you've been given in this life. So I try to maintain that. I know you do as well. There's other people like Hunter and so on. And curiously, at the end of the day, even though these atheists, with whatever reason, mostly I believe through bias, they want to deny any of these claims. But at the end of the day, what's most important is that we maintain a respectable position, which is far more important than just falling into the trap of ridicule, the type that G-Man unfortunately receives. And so, yeah, the fact that you yourself maintain a respectable position shows that ultimately you're not like so you do your work, you do your research, you want to honor truth, and it's the ball is in their court in that context in regards to what you share versus how they receive it and digest it. So yeah,
I want to get 2 more opinions in but before I shut this down for tonight. Achiwawa and Thaddeus. Thaddeus, you haven't said a word since you got in here. You've just been listening.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything too worth to say right now. What am I really going to add that hasn't been said already? I don't know,
Oh, well.
I mean,
I thought you were going to bring a different an opinion.
well, not really. I'm with you guys on this one. I think the atheists are kind of denying a lot of things that, make sense, common sense, that there should be a God out there. And it's like they just don't want to see it. And it makes
Your
sense.
position is no, you're like, yeah, God exists, but then like what you say afterwards is, I just don't like him, and that's okay. Like, why can't more people be like you, Thaddeus?
Well, I don't know. I think because I don't know how many people of them are actually like me. I think some of them are just a little too lazy to do the research, or they just don't care enough about it to do it.
General, what's my catchphrase? I say atheism is philosophical laziness.
yeah.
Achiwawa?
I keep telling them I have an entire Google Drive of 8 years worth of reading that I've personally conducted, and I share it happily. But It's
Yeah,
not.
they don't. They don't.
You know,
They
it's
don't want to
all,
look at that. They want to do their science stuff. So, Ashiwawa, Ashiwawa, you were in my Google Hangouts. I'm sorry, my Google post I had made like all day. Like you were like my brother in arms.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that the problem is that so with regard to the resurrection in particular, I think the problem is that they come at it approaching the topic from the position that God doesn't exist. And I think that it is somewhat rational to just, if you don't believe God exists, then it's somewhat rational to believe other theories besides the theory that Jesus rose from the dead. But if you believe that God exists, then it's not that extraordinary to claim that God raised somebody from the dead. So that's kind of the position I take. But it seems like they can't accept that position for the sake of the argument in order to look at the evidence for the resurrection.
Well, even what you just said about the extraordinary evidence type piece, I just wrote about that. And if people have this, and you know who made that quote famous? Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan goes and he says, "Oh, extraordinary claims require extraordinary." And no, they do not. If we really were realistic, that saying to like a court of law, and we're like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, every extraordinary murder case would be dismissed.
Right. No, I agree with you. What's the way I look at it is rather that some claims already has some evidence for it, right? So like the idea that God that there's somebody brought up there's a dog in my garage, right? He'll believe that there's a dog in my garage, but he won't believe that there's a God in my garage. So the reason for that isn't. I think if you just say it's because it's extraordinary, then it's kind of not as objectively, we can't really examine it objectively. But the reason is because we already know that dogs exist. Now, if we believe that gods exist and it's something that a god would do would be to be in a garage, then it's not that extraordinary. So it just has to do with what evidence we already have.
Well, take away the resurrection. Let's say we just have the Old Testament. We're back in Moses' day, and you're trying to talk to some Babylonian about why they should accept the Torah. You say something like, I don't know. We know that the Book of Exodus, or did the Book of Exodus even exist? Well, no, it didn't exist in his day. But all right, sometime afterward, you show somebody the Book of Exodus, and you're like, all right, the Book of Exodus is. Or it's at least reliable, and we know it's reliable because we have some of the evidences from this event happening. And you show somebody, now today we know that most of the events happening in the plagues could have been caused from a volcano. And so you show somebody some volcano rock or something like that. I'm just using this as a hypothetical. You show somebody a piece of evidence for the Exodus, and the evidence starts to stack up. Now you can't go back in time with them, and you can't show them the actual event happening. The only evidence you have is the evidence from after the fact. And you show these people the evidence that the event in Exodus happened. What you can't demonstrably prove is that God was the one who did it. But you have the evidence of what was recorded. Then the most rational conclusion, at least in my mind, is, well, it's very probable that this God
Yeah, I think you cut out there.
What?
You cut out.
This got what? This got what?
Dramatic.
It's very probable that this God does exist because you have the evidence of what was left behind from this supposed act of God. You can't show somebody God, but you can definitely show somebody the pieces left behind from the event.
Well, here's a thought as far as this, at least a thought on this. First, the case for God is especially in regards to all the stuff we have now, it's a cumulative case. You don't ask one line of reasoning to stand completely alone and prove everything. It's a cumulative case. And the evidence for the resurrection is a best explanation for the evidence. So if someone wants to present a different explanation, then they should offer it. that's actually where we get really happy, because we go, oh, we can talk about the swoon theory and things like this, and they go, it just doesn't fit the historical account. So the atheists are more and more being forced to saying that's simply not the historical account. Why do they feel like they have to say that's not historical? Because it pushes so hard towards the resurrection. So then you can argue for historicity, but that's obviously gets into a complicated and difficult conversation that most people, they just kind of like make big, broad, sweeping statements which are not accepted by the majority. Not that I rely on the majority, but if you disagree with the majority, you should be able to build your case and explain why, not just say stuff.
The only thing I'd say to you is don't go down the route of, this is what the atheists always do, because that's how you start sounding like G-Man and them. Don't go down that route. Don't generalize like that.
Yeah. What did I say that sounded like that?
Well, you started to say, like, you know, like, then they have, well, not you specifically, I'm just saying, like, be like careful, because some people do that.
Yeah, and you'll lose the people on the fence doing that.
Oh, well, and it's not accurate to just make too broad sweeping. I did say what I feel like. I tend to be really careful in the way I word things, but that often backfires on me because I expect people to notice the little nuanced way I said something. But yeah, I think it's what the consistent atheist is forced to do, rather than this is what atheists always do.
Ah, okay.
Which is a very different kind of claim. But I do think King Crocoduck, I was really happy he brought up that syllogism. That was bold. And he was honest. After your debate, during the discussion, he was just, hey guys, what do you think about my syllogism? Do you see any problems with it? So he asked the open question. Here's my response to that. I would love to hear him describe, what do you mean by natural, and to respond to the specific, issues that at least I think are in that syllogism.
I also would want to know what would actually convince him of the resurrection. I'm very curious, and I say that because, like I said in my post earlier on Google Plus, it's very relevant to this discussion, because I think I had said something along the lines of, it seems to me, not every atheist, but a lot of atheists I know in this circle, there could be, some outside the circle who, it's the opposite. But it seems like the atheists in at least the Google community, they do that. There is, or every theologian or philosopher who has ever come before me has never put forth an adequate or legitimate argumentation for the existence of God. There is no good argument for God's existence, and I really find that hard to believe for both sides, because I definitely know there are some very good arguments for atheism, but there are also some very good rebuttals to those arguments. So I haven't seen anybody in this community even admit, you know what, that was a good theistic argument. And when I put that post in the Google Great Debate Community page, I got a lot of people saying that's because there are no good arguments for theism. Well, I mean, if that's your line of thinking, then I don't think you're going to change your mind.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair to say, actually. Although it would be nice if there was more scientific evidence, like we can measure this God and stuff, but I mean, I know that's not going to happen necessarily. So whatever.
It seems difficult because science requires a thing to be part of this universe in order for it to be examined, and God, by definition, transcends the universe. So science is not designed to test him.
Yeah, that's a fun one.
Still there if you want for a surf.
So I just wanted to mention I cited this book to General earlier, but there's a good book that just came out on the existence of God that I just read yesterday, actually, called Five Arguments. I think it's called Five Arguments Proving God's Existence by Edward Feser. I would recommend that to you guys. I can give you a link.
Yeah, I was about to actually keep you linking.
Yeah, they have a Kindle version, so it's easy to get a hand on.
I will buy it on Wednesday. Remind me. One of the last books I actually bought was Astrophysics for People in a Hurry by Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I would agree with Neil on all of the science, but his philosophy behind the science is just bad. Keep your children away. So I think.
I'm sorry. Maybe I can share one last thought. Like, I do think that, okay, like if whatever substance God is, it's not material, it's not of this universe. So you couldn't put it in a test tube and measure it and that sort of thing. If God's presence came into a room, I wouldn't expect there to be a scientific measurement, a Geiger counter that would go off. But you can use science to inform people on things related to God's existence that aren't sort of evidence for God directly but indirectly, like the whole Kalam cosmological argument, the information theory that the ID guys are working on, the idea of fine-tuning and design, relating to design as well. So I think that that's where science does actually contribute to the conversation. But if you expect to put something supernatural, some sort of chemical that's the God molecule, then that's not a biblical definition of who God is, actually.
Well, interesting.
Are you gonna have that debate with Barney, Wayne? Because I heard it was one.
Barney might have come in here.
Yeah, I saw him like.
Who's Barney?
He commented on one of your things, and he said that he wanted to have a debate with you or something.
Oh, he wanted to have a discussion. I'll probably have to have that with him on another time. That totally slipped my mind.
Oh, okay.
Whenever I have another hangout, we can definitely talk about that. But yeah, like as you guys can see, I'm more than open to talk with different beliefs and etc. Like different atheists. It's just that it gets frustrating because and this is what Steve said. Theists we have to fight an uphill battle because our burden of proof is supposedly a lot harder than atheists, which I would agree. Like when you have a position where, like I said, all you have to do is deny, and we have to convince you. Hard to a lot of things.
I don't accept that burden of proof because I don't think it's my job to convince anybody, right? My job is simply to present the evidence and let them make their own decision, because you can't convince. There's many people you can't convince. So it's up to them to actually study the evidences for themselves and come to a rational conclusion in the search for truth.
Well, I'll tell you what. When I was examining the evidence for evolution, what actually convinced me wasn't the fact that somebody gave me this very good argument and I said, oh, you know what? I'm going to change my mind. I had thought about it and I looked at the cumulative case, and in my head I said, you know what? I have a lot more evidence for evolution being true than not true. And I made the decision to change my opinion. And in the same light, I think that if non-theists had that same state of mind where they would at least think on these things and say, you know what, I think I have a lot more evidence for the resurrection or the historicity of Jesus, or more valid arguments for the existence of God than not, then they would be more in a position to change their mind. Because I don't know, like I said, it seems like a lot of people's atheism today is very unfalsifiable. And once people can come to an agreement on what they would and would not accept as evidence, you can start laying down those evidences on the table and you can start building a case.
Right. Yeah, I think for the atheist community in general, of course not all of them, but the ones, the majority that I've seen, they make a case for skepticism. And from what I can tell, skepticism is just denying anything that you don't want to believe with as hardly as you can, pretty much. And that's an issue.
You know what? There's skepticism and there's cynicism. I actually learned this from Hugh Ross. He taught me a new word. There's skepticism and there's cynicism, from what I've heard. And skepticism is being skeptical when the burden of proof or the burden of evidence haven't been met. But cynicism is being skeptical in spite of the evidence. Here you go. So I think I'm going to end this hangout, though. You guys can talk offline, but this was a really good hangout, and I don't want to make it like 4 or 5 hours because nobody's going to watch. So, but until next time, for the people watching, good luck and good night.